thank you to everyone for joining us today for this critical conversation about partisan fairness and Michigan's new redistricting process. As you all know, in 2018, 61% of Michiganders voted to end partisan gerrymandering and to establish a fair, impartial, and transparent process that's led by our very own Michigan Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission. Now, on August 20th, the MIRC, the commission, made history by holding its very first mapping session in full view of the public. And from now through November, the commission's work will focus on drafting proposed maps that will meet all 7 constitutional criteria in ranked order. And today, our discussion is going to be, when we say fair, impartial, and transparent, what do we mean by fair? And I'm thrilled to have this conversation with a national leading redistricting expert to really drill down and talk about how we achieve districts that are both fair, but then also meet the other constitutional criteria that are supposed to govern the process. Ruth Greenwood is the director of the Election Law Clinic at Harvard Law School, and she has litigated 2 history-making partisan gerrymandering cases before the US Supreme Court, one of which won the first ever tri-coalition claim under the Federal Voting Rights Act in Holloway versus City of Virginia Beach, In addition, Ruth has advised dozens of state advocates on drafting and implementing independent redistricting commissions, including Michigan, state voting rights acts, and adopting ranked choice voting. Ruth, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you for having me. It is great to be here. I will share my screen. Hopefully this will work. Okay, here we go. Partisan fairness, redistricting without political advantage. So you'll see in my, let me try to go down. Oh, there we go. In my slides, I started out with this quote from 1973 from the US Supreme Court, because even though in the last 10 years, there's been a lot of discussion about partisan gerrymandering and a lot of punditry about it. This is something that, I mean, obviously the term goes back to 1812, but the Supreme Court has really been aware that drawing lines anywhere will have some kind of political consequence. So I'll just read through this from Gaffney v. Cummings. It is not only obvious, but absolutely unavoidable that the location and shape of districts may well determine the political complexion of the area. So I think one of the takeaways I hope you get from today is that when thinking about partisan fairness or the partisan implications of a map, that there is always going to be a partisan implication, and it is good to be conscious of that fact and aware and thinking about which sort of implications you want and what you think is fair. So I'm going to go through these ones relatively slowly. These are some slides that pull up pictures from a website called planscore.org that I helped to develop, in that an amazing tech guy said, I think we can do this. And I was like, I would love if you could. And so I helped to make it happen. But basically, this has 2 components. What I'm showing you here is the historical part of the website, because if I tell you a number, like an efficiency gap number of 12, is 12 big? Is 12 small? I mean, it really depends on context. And so the point of PlanScore was to show, since 1972, which is really the modern redistricting era, what types of partisan advantage have there been in plans, both towards Democrats and Republicans. And so if you look on the left side, this is the Michigan congressional plan that was used from 2012 to 2020. You can see that because it says US House. And then we're looking first at the efficiency gap score. I'm going to go through each of these types of ways to measure partisan fairness. But the efficiency gap, the key thing to look at here is this histogram. It's blue on the left and it's red on the right. And that shows you that both sides have gerrymandered like crazy, basically, since 1972. So there have been these outliers, but the bulk of plans have actually been close to a 0 efficiency gap. That is a plan that doesn't give advantage to voters from either party in the way their votes translate into seats. And so I'm not going to go into huge detail about what the efficiency gap means, but if you look at the bar graph here, basically D's and R's all go out and vote. And some of the votes convert into seats and some of them don't. And so we talk about them, or in political science, they talk about them as efficient and inefficient votes. And you can see here, there are more inefficient votes that Democrats are casting than Republicans. And so Michigan is a relatively 50-50 state. And so you would think, hey, about 50% of the vote, about 50% of the seats. But even in places like Wyoming, or I'm sitting here in Massachusetts, that are essentially 60-70% for Republicans or Democrats, you can still have a zero efficiency gap, because it's about how people are able to vote and then have those votes convert into seats, and whether Democrats and Republicans are being treated equally in that process. So basically here you can see that the Michigan congressional plan had an efficiency gap for the last decade of 12%. And this shows you, it's not the most extreme, right? The most extreme was one of the ones I litigated in North Carolina, which was more out in the 25% range. But it's pretty extreme, right? It is something that is, we would call a historical outlier. That's the efficiency gap. Over here on the right, I've shown you what's called the declination. The declination, there's this little chart to show you essentially there are seats won by Republicans in red, seats won by Democrats in blue, and the declination actually measures the angle. I do not remember my geometry very well, and you don't have to either. The point is that we can run this score, and I don't know what 0.37 means, but I can see this histogram, and this shows you the distribution of all of the declination scores since 1972. And the point that you'll see on this is that it doesn't really matter which metric you use. The efficiency gap, the declination, I'll go to the next page where I have the partisan bias and the mean median difference. All of them essentially have a similar type of histogram. There are some outliers on the DNR side. There's a good bulk near the middle. And this congressional plan from the last decade is over on the side of giving quite a lot of advantage to the Republican voters over Democratic voters. So that's the congressional plan. And I also think it's relevant to start with this to just explain where you're coming from. The reason I was kind of beaming with smiles at the beginning when Nancy was talking is Michigan was one of the most wonderful things I could have imagined happening. When I was litigating the Whitford and then the Russo cases in the Supreme Court, I heard about Katie Fahey and Nancy up in Michigan and how they thought they could make a change. And the very first thing I heard was, they're going to do a volunteer effort to gather signatures. And I was like, oh, I was living in Chicago. We had tried that in Illinois. We had failed, to get enough signatures. And I was like, well, I guess that's that then. And then lo and behold, you guys got on the ballot. And then I was like, oh, those courts are going to stop it. Lo and behold, you beat it in the courts and managed to get it on the ballot. And then it actually won at the ballot box. So it has been this story of like, I'm so excited that everybody got together and believed in this, and that it also includes criteria like partisan fairness, right? It recognizes that that's a problem in Michigan. As you can see in the last decade, it's been very skewed, and you're trying to do something about it, which is great. Okay, so that's the congressional plan. I'm just showing you the efficiency gap scores for the others because, as I mentioned, they basically all point in the same direction. So the Senate plan, you can see, was actually very pro-Republican from a historical perspective. It's almost out at the furthest right outlier edge. And then the House plan, again, very skewed in favor of Republicans, not as extreme as some other state House plans. Again, the one that's right on the edge, I think, is the Wisconsin one that I sued over last decade. But you're starting from a place of the current lines, if you kept them, would really give it a big advantage to Republican voters over Democratic voters. So what can we do about that? Well, you have probably seen these a million times, the Michigan criteria. I really just wanted to highlight two things that come up, because it's all very well to say, yes, I want partisan fairness, but when the rubber meets the road, what does that mean? How do you actually operationalize that? So as Nancy mentioned, these are all listed in order of priority. So the first thing is the districts have to be of equal population. That's just a kind of a toggle, yes or no, are they equal or not? They have to be contiguous. That also is a yes or no. But then once you get into reflecting the state's diverse population and communities of interest, it's not a yes or no light switch. There are different ways that you can conceive of communities. And I know that Michigan has had a lot of discussion and used that MGGG website to put in your communities. And I've seen the report that goes through and talks about where people consider their communities to be and so on. And that is a really important conversation. But so that is something that is hard to quantify exactly. And then you get down to D, which is the districts shall not provide a disproportionate advantage to any political party. And so I thought, and I mean, the other things in terms of favoring incumbents and so on, these can all come into it, and I'm happy to talk about them all. But I thought, let's just look at, if these two things conflict, what do you do? So my hypothetical one is more of an example than a hypothetical. This is the congressional plan from 2016 from North Carolina. And I know this well because I sued this plan. And actually, if you look here, I've zoomed in on Guilford County. So that's the county that on the left-hand side is green, it's in the 13th district, and on the right-hand side is purple in the 6th district. That's actually where Greensboro is, and that is where the federal courthouse sits. And so our court case was in the middle of those lines. But the other thing that's interesting about Greensboro is there is an HBCU campus right there. And that line that you see on this map divides the campus, right? And there are many ways to talk about communities, but a campus of students who have chosen to go to an HBCU and usually are, super politically active, I think is, to anybody, you could identify that as a pretty clear community of interest. And that community got split. And we believe very intentionally got split to give advantage, in this case, to Republican voters. So when you draw alternate plans of North Carolina, if you keep the HBCU all together, almost all of the time, you end up with one Democratic and one Republican district around Guilford County. But whenever you split Greensboro down the middle, you end up with 2 Republican districts, right? So this is a place where you can both keep a community of interest together and improve partisan fairness. So that's great. And there are going to be a lot of places where there's no conflict. In fact, these 2 criteria work together. So that's awesome. Slightly harder one. Now, this is definitely a hypothetical because I don't actually know Seattle well. I love using Seattle as an example because it has strange geography, right? There's islands and contours and rivers, and you get this feeling of like it's the edge of the map. There maybe aren't as many possibilities as, in the middle of a big square state. So what I have postulated here is that District 9 that you can see running along, I guess, Puget Sound, that could be a white community of Democrats. They're closer into the city. Let's assume that that's a group of Democrats. And maybe because they're all along Puget Sound, they have a sense of community and they want to be in a district together. But if you put all of that group in that district, that could mean essentially packing in Democrats and having a 70, 80, 90% district. And then the district on the other side that goes out through King and Pierce counties would be super Republican. Now, the thing here is, even if you really want to do that and you're like, look, it is going to mean that these districts are not competitive and one's going D and one's going R, and we're not doing what we would consider partisan fairness in this part of the map. The point about a map is that you have districts all over, right? So if in this place you want to keep this community together and that has a negative consequence for your efficiency gap or whatever measure of partisan fairness you're using, you can still look at other areas of the map to try to make sure that there are enough places where Democrats and Republicans are both efficiently converting their votes into seats. So here, as I say, it might be possible you can find places, and I didn't use Michigan because I don't know it well as all of you, and I figured I'd get into real hot water, but I'm sure somebody in a question can give an example of somewhere where, hey, if we keep this community together, we're packing in either Democrats together or we're packing Republicans together or some partisan consequence. And so my point is, it's not only there that you have to look, but around the whole map. And then the last hypothetical is there is no possible way, right? They are set against each other. You can only preserve a community of interest, or you can ensure partisan fairness. And I put a picture of the universe here because, I mean, I presume you've had people like Moon Dushan, speak to you about I don't even know what the number is. I don't know what comes after billion, trillion, quadrillion, whatever it is. There are more possible plans for Michigan than there are stars in the universe. So the idea that there isn't one, or probably thousands or millions of plans that can actually achieve multiple goals at once is ludicrous. There will be a plan. And it's just a matter of understanding what partisan fairness really means, what protecting communities means, and also looking all around the map, not just in one area, but all across the map to make sure that you're looking at those two things. And it's not just those two things. We looked before at the list of criteria. And so, contiguity comes into it, equal population and all the rest of it. But I guess I'm here to assure you there is a way to balance all of these things. And I'm sure, well, I hope the commission will find it. So I thought I can get rid of this thing. We could maybe move to questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Ruth. Again, I'm just so grateful, that you joined us today. I think everyone can just, not only is Ruth a brilliant legal mind and litigator, but we just got a glimpse of like, what a wonderful educator you are. Like, I'm sure all of us would love to take your clinic as you, really dig into what are seeming, they are, there's a push and a pull. These are complex things. And there's like a balancing act that we have to do. And all of that is really important to keep in mind as we're trying to draw these districts. So thank you so much for that. And right now I am really excited to kind of dig into some of these questions that we've gotten from the audience, some of which were submitted prior to today, and then some that we're getting kind of in real time. So one question I'd like to start with is the fourth criterion in the constitutional amendment for Michigan mandates partisan fairness, which we were just talking about. But does that mean that the districts should be more competitive in the future?
That is a great question. So competitiveness is a value and partisan fairness is a value, and you may want one or both of them, but they're different. And let me just explain generally. Competitiveness is usually defined as districts that are within about a 5 percentage point. So say a 45-55 district. So if the vote swings 5% either way, then the districts will change. And some people really want competitiveness, and that can be great. In fact, some states require competitiveness in their districts. Now, partisan fairness, let me basically explain this. You could have a district, and actually Washington State is a state that did this because they require competitiveness. You could have all of your districts be 52-48, right? And then if everybody votes exactly that same way, the 52% party get in and they have 100% of the seats. So that would be very competitive, but we wouldn't consider that to be fair in a partisan sense because 48% of the state voted for one party and got no representatives whatsoever. Now, again, it's competitive, so it's going to be a huge advantage for one side. Say the vote swings 3 points the other way, the other side has a huge advantage, and you see the things like the efficiency gap going back and forth between the parties over the decade. So that would be a way to get lots of competitiveness without partisan fairness. You actually can get a lot of partisan fairness without competitiveness as well, because you can say, okay, well, let's divide it up and we'll have some really safe Democratic seats and some really safe Republican seats and maybe just like 1 or 2 competitive seats. So as the votes shift, 1 or 2 seats change, but everything else stays the same. Technically, you could have partisan fairness. You could have, a zero efficiency gap in that scenario. But some people might think that there are other democratic harms. So they are both important. I think they're important values, and everybody needs to decide what they want and what they think is important. But in terms of partisan fairness, you can protect it with or without competitiveness.
Great, thank you. And one of the things that our commission is doing, partly because of the data it's had to work with, and kind of like the rolling basis in which this data has come in, it did start to draw districts with taking into account the first step, all of the COI kind of input that it got, right? Trying to understand where these COIs are with the help of Manduchin, as you said. And so it started drawing these maps around COIs without considering partisan fairness. So do you think that's a mistake? And what is kind of the best practice of doing this with taking into account both of those criteria?
Yeah, I don't know that I would say it's a mistake or a best practice. I mean, I think there are so many ways to get to the right outcome in this because there are so many map options. I think that given the ordering of the criteria, it makes sense to start with communities and put them in there. But then also you have to consider partisan fairness. So it sounds like it's actually a pretty good process to go in and look and then say, hey, I mean, the sort of big joke from that Gaffney v. Cummings case was Connecticut in the 1970s I think it wasn't Rehnquist. I think it was Bork, maybe Robert Bork, who ended up not being put on the Supreme Court because he was considered a huge partisan. He said, I'm going to redraw the lines of Connecticut and I'm not going to look at any partisan data. And he basically drew a massive Democratic gerrymander because he didn't know where people were. And nobody accused him of wanting Democrats to get in power. Right. But if you ignore race, if you ignore partisanship, much like if you ignore race, you can accidentally help one party or another. So I think looking at communities and working out where to keep them together, but then throwing on the partisan data and assessing it and saying, okay, well, wait a second, what's not fair here? Where can we make changes that will still preserve communities, but also ensure that Republicans and Democrats are treated equally when they go to vote?
Great. Let's see. How would the commission respond to saying that adjusting the maps in the name of partisan fairness is just taking power away from Republicans? Because as you mentioned before, partisan gerrymandering led to our maps being skewed in favor of Republicans.
Well, yeah. So I guess it's a question of when you say take away, I wouldn't consider it to be a legitimate sense of power. While you were all in Michigan having your Republican gerrymanders, I was living in Chicago with Democrats in control and very uncompetitive districts. And so it can go both ways. And I don't think whichever party's in power should get to rest on their laurels and be like, well, we rigged the system and now we'll just keep going. If you look at the voters, Michigan is a swing state, right? It switches between the two, and the people that you elect should reflect that, right? It probably should be the case in the last decade that you should have shifted power back and forth. So will it reduce Republican power? Almost certainly, right? Because the Republican power was sort of an ill-gotten gain. But will it mean that Republicans and Democrats as voters are treated more equally? Like, yes, right? So it's not giving one party an advantage over another. It's actually bringing it back to a level where it doesn't matter who you vote for, you will be treated equally.
Yeah, that's great. And it kind of, there was a conversation very early on that we had about whether to start with the current maps and just kind of tweak around the edges to account for population changes, right? And one of, VMP was very staunchly against because of what you just said, right? It's like there was a huge partisan gerrymander built in, and our point is to understand what fair maps are, not to tweak, extreme gerrymandered, unfair maps. So I think
and it is the case sometimes, right, that there is a particular legislator that has represented a particular area and people feel this real kinship with that person, and there's some way that beyond just it's my district, I should get to be elected from it. There are some reasons why, if there's seniority, in a legislature or something, that a community might get together and say, we really want to keep electing someone together. It may be that person, but we don't want to be, split up between two other districts. And that's when the communities of interest argument comes in. And so if your community is more than just, well, we've usually gone to one person. If it's like, well, there's actually common characteristics between us, then that is a value. I just think that, looking at lines that were there before and being like, oh, that must represent communities. Great, let's do that again. It's a little naive.
Well, especially here when we have evidence that it was actually the opposite, right? There was no consideration of COI. So great. So do you mind elaborating on a point you made about, partisan fairness is really looking at the fairness of your map in total, right? The state as a whole. And so you can make decisions to keep, for example, one community together where it looks packed and unfair from a partisan standpoint, but you can look elsewhere and sort of offset that. So what does that mean? What if you took your Seattle example, right, and you had the Democrat and the very safe Republican districts, what kind of thing can you do to offset the lack of partisan fairness in that one little area?
Oh, that's a good point. I meant to talk about where you could do that, right? So it depends. If you look across the state, I would usually say, are there other cities where you could seed districts that are probably more competitive? And we know in Washington there are, because they do it all the time. But, so could you look out to Yakima or someone, somewhere further out and say, okay, well, that district could be a lot more competitive. So it's going to flip back and forth between D's and R's, even though these two districts are super safe and they're sitting that way. And then the other place, of course, is on the edges of cities, right? So if you go north of Seattle, maybe that community isn't needing to be kept together. It's not along Puget Sound, it's going up, and so maybe you can split that and have two districts again that maybe both of them go back and forth between D's and R's. And so as the votes change, you're actually representing how many Ds or how many Rs were voted for. It's a good point that you can't look at a district. So I know with things like racial gerrymandering, you can look at a district and say that district is a quote unquote gerrymander. But with partisanship, I mean, that map I showed you from North Carolina, none of those districts look particularly weird. They actually look kind of square, kind of nice, but it's a massive gerrymander. It's a huge advantage for one side, and it cuts communities. If you know the people on the ground, you can know the communities that it cuts. And so it's a concept that is not district specific. You know, communities, compactness, contiguity are usually district concept, right? Can I walk everywhere in this district without leaving? Is it contiguous? But partisan fairness, you can't look at a district and say that's fair or not. You just have to say, well, what's happening around it, right? How are the voters of the whole state being treated? And I mean, Michigan is such a big state with R's and D's everywhere that I imagine there are so many interesting ways that you can combine populations to get fair maps. In fact, I'm pretty sure that the evidence in the court case that came out through Michigan was that if you were to run it without considering partisanship, the vast majority of plans actually end up with, once you assess partisan fairness, they're actually very fair. You have to do a bit of work to make them unfair.
Gotcha. Let's see. There's some really interesting questions in here. They could really kind of inspire really long conversations that are a little bit outside our scope, unfortunately, today. But you know, hopefully we can have.
Do you want me to talk about this one that I don't know who David Barnowski is, but the map behind me? I actually had a friend help me make this. So the Census Bureau in the last decade created a map like this for high schools, but they didn't create one for Census 2020. So I went on and like cut out all of the Census 2020 things and made my own map so that I can easily see. I like to remember the top left is the population density, because one thing when you think about districts, people are like, oh, like let's just draw some squares, and you're like, well, then you're going to get like everyone in Detroit in one district and like, you know, some other place with no population. So one reminds me of density. Then it has race and ethnicity, so race along the bottom and ethnicity at the top right, and then in the middle I have the population change to remember that, you know, some states are growing and some states are becoming less. Anyway, so I made it myself.
That's awesome. Very cool. Yeah. So yeah, Ruth, if you see any questions that you know would love to answer, please do.
So one thing here, Chris Andrews asked regarding the metrics I had, like what is an acceptable level of bias? I mean, that is still an open question. So far, we have managed to go to courts, in state courts, admittedly at the Supreme Court, they didn't go for it, but in state court, they have said, you know, an extreme outlier is bad enough. We haven't gone close enough in to say, well, where do we actually put those bounds? Mm-hmm. But generally, the descriptive definition is if it is a large and durable gerrymander, right? So I talked to you about that, you know, if you have 10 districts and they're 52-48, you would get a large advantage for one side, but it wouldn't be durable. As soon as the votes shift, it'd go the other way. So we would probably say, well, that's not something, I would think that you could say that's an acceptable level of bias because it switches. And the reason we put those histograms on there to show you is to try to say, well, look, in the last 50 years, people have been trying to gain advantage, but also there have been places trying to do the right thing. And even when everyone's trying to get advantage, you still get a good amount around the middle. So we thought, well, at least comparing outliers, that will give you something. When we had a political scientist have to sort of forced to give an opinion on what he thinks is over under acceptable, he thought a 7% efficiency gap for state house plans. I think it's slightly higher for Congress because of the way the numbers work. But basically, if you can keep it under 7%, usually that won't be durable. You know, you'll eventually get a switch back, even if it starts out advantaging one side.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, right? So, you know, as the public, one of the things that we really wanted to make sure was, you know, the public would have confidence in the system. And one of, you know, the important things there is to set expectations. So what I hear you saying is that the maps, the final maps, to be fair, doesn't mean that you're trying to hit 0%, right? Advantage from one party or the other.
Right, it might be, yeah. I mean, actually, I think the Colorado Commission came out with one which was bang on 0, and I was like, okay, well, that's amazing, because most of them it's like 3 or 4, you know, because the votes change and it depends which elections you use and so on. But all of the ones that Michigan produces will be run through PlanScore, and there'll be, you know, links up on the PlanScore website so you can see. And if you draw a map, you can run it through PlanScore and just see as well.
Very cool. There is one question here about how the idea of partisan fairness works hand in hand with the idea of unpacking or uncracking or, uncracking in the Voting Rights Act.
Yeah, that's a good point. So because race and partisanship are highly correlated in some instances, when you are talking about making sure that you enfranchise a minority community. So let's talk about, say, a Black community. You want to, the Supreme Court has says you can't do what's called racial gerrymandering, as in be like, oh, all of these Black people are here. Let's stick them all in one district. Let's make it a 90% Black district. Understandably, that seems offensive to the Constitution, right? You're just picking people just because of the color of their skin. But the Federal Voting Rights Act says, well, given the history of discrimination in this country, we do need to recognize that where there actually is racially polarized voting, white people prefer some candidates, Black people prefer other candidates. If that exists, we need to make sure that there are places that the communities of color can elect their candidates of choice. And so the thing here, again, is it's balancing, right? It's like, do you need to draw a 55% district? Maybe not, right? If there are some white liberals, maybe you need a 45 or a 40% district. But the point is the controlling majority in a primary will be the Black community. They will be able to elect the candidate of the primary and then be in control of who gets elected to Congress. And that will, give a community that historically has been completely shut out of the process some meaningful representation. And so when we talk about cracking and packing, you can crack and pack partisans, or you can crack and pack people of color. And sometimes they have consequences for each other. And I think with all of these things, it's just a matter of, it's not like a formula. I mean, you can put stuff into a computer algorithm and spit some stuff out. But usually then, whenever I've done this, I've had algorithms run and I show them to people on the ground and they're like, oh, I guess that is like partisan fair. They're like, but it's really weird to put those communities together. So I'm like, great, let's find another way to do it. And then you look at another map and there's another way. And so hopefully that discussion is what will happen in Michigan about, what is considered too much cracking or packing.
That's great. And things like this, we're hoping will generate a lot of public interest and then, more participation. So the thing is about offsets and things, if you see the commission come up with draft maps, which you think are not partisan, they're not fair in that one specific area, then the public, I'm hoping, will, take advantage of the fact that they can submit other maps about, to show kind of how you achieve that on a state basis.
I think that's exactly right, because the argument that we used to get when legislators would draw these things behind closed doors were like, well, there was no other way we could do it. Whereas the whole point here is you're like, no, I have a map. Let me show you. This is exactly how you can do it, right? And actually protect all of these different criteria. I also find that I like to run things, through Plan Score and get the numbers, but generally people on the ground who do politics will look at a map and be like, that's not fair. and inevitably they're exactly right. It's like, I didn't technically need the computer. You could have just told me, but I like to back it up.
Cool. Let's see.
I think that the Sandra Serini Elsa question is interesting about it seems unfair to voters in one district to make up for it in another district. This has come up in the context of the Voting Rights Act as well. And I guess the point is, unfortunately, in that case, the alternatives are either you have no power where you are and also no power elsewhere, or you maybe don't have power in your particular district because you are the perpetual minority. There's 30% of you and you're never going to be able to get that district. But you are made up for by the fact that there's another district of like-minded people. And you can go and campaign there and work on that and help to get people elected. I did this a lot when I worked in Wisconsin. There were people who were in the city of Milwaukee in very Democratic districts. And they were like, well, we're electing a Democrat anyway. I'm going to go out further and try to elect Democrats across the state. And then there were people who were in completely Republican districts and they were like, well, I'm not going to be able to get this district change, but what if I go to this other place and see what I can do to get the legislature overall to be representative? And so I think for both sides, we just sort of have to recognize that a legislative body, yes, you have your personal representative to go to, but you are also represented by the group as a whole. When they make a decision, it doesn't matter what your rep has said, it matters what the whole body does. And so that's why I think of this as being a thing where you can trade off a little between different areas. Now, I am sure that at some point there'll be, people who are like, no, I want my competitive district. No, I want my competitive district. And that is not my decision to make. The commission can make that decision. But so long as either solution will ensure that Democrats and Republicans are equally able to convert their votes into seats, I think we would consider that fair.
Right. Can you talk a little bit about how the different kinds of maps might work together for that, to achieve partisan fairness, even for a particular area too, like the state house, state senate, and congressional?
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. Right. So you have to consider the fact that you have different levels of representation. And so it might be that in your house district, you're sitting there in a red district, it's never changing, it's red. But in your Senate district, it's super competitive. And it's actually a good point that if you do have this dispute between areas, like we should get the competitive thing, well, why not make the state Senate have competitiveness here and then the House, there. And then, of course, there's Congress as well, where you can, the congressional thing is interesting because you're electing a group of people, but then they become part of a huge body, right, in Congress. But in the state, it's true that you have the House and the Senate for a reason, right? You might not like one of your reps, but maybe you like the other one.
Yeah. I remember that because that's how the 2011 California commissioners said they tried to, make sure that communities were kind of taken care of, right?
That's really clever.
Yeah.
That's really clever.
And another way I think they tried to do that was to use kind of trends, like demographic trends in drawing districts, right? So you may not have the voting, majority right now, but as the trends, indicate over time, you might. So do you mind talking about how you might use like the demographic data to kind of, draw maps as they will kind of be used for the next 10 years?
Yeah, it's a good point. So all maps, districting plans, I guess, unless they get struck down by a court, get used for 5 elections. And actually, you're right, California is a pioneer on this. They have this amazing ability to work out who's under 18, but people who are 10 now are going to be voting by the end of the decade. What level do we have of people converting from green cards to citizenship? What level do we have of people leaving the state? Who's coming into the state? And you can put all that stuff together to get a sense of what's growing and the types of people that are growing in those areas. And you all live in Michigan, right? Like you probably know, like, oh, like this area of town's growing, nobody wants to live over there. Like this is going to have a whole bunch of apartment blocks and there's going to be all these people, or like this is all young families and all those kids are going to turn 18 and vote. And so for a commission to do that, I think it's really sophisticated, but it's a great way. When I was telling you that partisan fairness is something that you should care about, not just when it's large, but when it's durable. And so it might be the case that something at this exact next election, something, seems weird or whatever, or you get a big efficiency gap the first time. But then throughout the decade, because of the demographic changes, it actually kind of settles in and becomes overall fair. So I guess that's another point with these things, that the plan score model or any models that the commission are using are trying to predict a kind of average environment for 2022. And it might not be average, right? It might be a huge swing one way or the other. And so then you might see the numbers a little different, but you can't just assess it based on that one election. The thing we can do is look at the last decade and be like, it didn't matter. 12, 14, 16, 18, very different electoral environments, didn't matter. Everything was still advantaging one party.
Well, that was our reality, actually. That's
right. No, that was Michigan, right?
Yeah. Unfortunately. Your point actually about you mentioning that 10-year-olds right now will be able to vote in the next redistricting cycle. I mean, that is crazy. I hadn't really put that together because I have an 11-year-old and she's, the next time the maps are voting. Yeah. I mean, but anyway, I think that also, just goes to show how important these maps are and how important this process is. Like these maps, we're going to have to look at them for 10 years of the elections, and 10 years is a really long time.
Yeah, it's a good point. So Nancy, even if you get discouraged, think about your daughter and be like, does she want me to make sure it's fair? So when her first vote comes, it counts, right? When she gets to vote, it's not like, oh, here's the rigged system and my vote doesn't count, right? If she gets that first experience where it works really well, and I guess for everyone with children, the statistics show people go on to be lifelong voters if when they first vote, they feel that they can make a difference. And so hopefully in Michigan, you'll have this, it'll produce this boom in turnout.
Yes.
I mean, already Michigan, I think, is pretty good. The upper Midwest is pretty good in turnout, but maybe you can beat Minnesota.
I know, right? It's always, yeah, Minnesota is like the ones to catch. Let's see. Oh, well, we have time for, I think, one more question. You find one that's kind of sticks out to you.
The Bridget Bly one. So I'm wondering about the problems of using the efficiency gap where there's self-packing.
Okay.
And this is so that this concept of the big sort, has come out about people living near people that are like them. This is why I have my my map behind me that includes population density, because even if people live next to other people that are like them, when you draw districts, you can draw them in all kinds of ways. You can draw them, as I say, like from Puget Sound, you can go all the way up to Canada, or you can keep it really enclosed in the city and just in this one area. So just because there are clumps of people in some places doesn't have to translate to the way that the districts get drawn. And this is the thing where algorithms can show you like all the wacky ways that you could draw districts. And as I say, sometimes if you just sort of let an algorithm go, people look at it, they're like, that is so crazy. It's like, but it's just a bunch of lines, right? And it just shows you a different way that you could configure how things happen. So this got raised in both North Carolina and Wisconsin. I think in Wisconsin, with there's a large concentration of Democrats in Milwaukee and Madison, and there's a very slight, like maybe a 2% bias in your average map that you would get out of Wisconsin will be 2% in favor of Republicans. So there's a little effect. In North Carolina, interestingly, for congressional maps, it sort of has the perfect political geography to help Democrats because it has a series of medium-sized cities, and each of them can seed a district. And so actually in that case, it was a maybe even more than 2% advantage for Democrats in the average map. So there is a little bit of bias built in, but it's a lot less than what gets built in by politicians trying to advantage themselves. But yeah, it's a good question. It comes up a lot.
Well, great. I see our time is up, but again, I'm so grateful for you, for those, who don't know, like we pulled this together in a matter of days, and, I know how much you have going on, but the fact that we have such a champion of democracy, that's like able to come and speak to us and really guide us, as we're going about this really historic process here in Michigan. I think it's just fantastic, and we're really lucky to have you.
Oh, no, thank you so much. As I say, I've been so excited that this whole Michigan thing happened and is working, and I'm really excited to see what comes out of it. And just even seeing how many people are here today enthused about this and getting ready to, testify to the commission is just so awesome. So good luck. I'll be watching.
Okay, great. And speaking of, thank you so much for all of our participants today. And then thank you so much for our team for pulling this together as well. I thought this was a fantastic discussion, and I hope we have many more to come during this process. So thank you guys. Thank you, Ruth.
Bye.
Have a great day.